What if I told you that a single moment in a blizzard could change not just one life, but two lives forever? What you're about to hear isn't just another animal rescue story. This is about a tiny grizzly bear cub who walked 8 miles through a deadly snowstorm, following a complete stranger, begging for help in the most heartbreaking way possible. And what this man did next will leave you speechless and restore your faith in humanity. It was March 15th, and Jake Morrison had no idea this would be the day that would define the rest of his life. The 34-year-old park ranger was making his final patrol through Glacier National Park before the worst blizzard in decades was set to hit Montana. The Weather Service had issued severe warnings, and Jake knew he had maybe 2 hours before conditions became life-threatening. The wind was already picking up, sending icy needles of snow sideways across the frozen landscape. Jake pulled his heavy winter coat tighter as he trudged through the knee-deep powder, his boots crunching with each step. He'd been doing these patrols for 12 years, but something felt different today. The forest was too quiet even for winter. The usual sounds of wildlife had vanished, as if every creature knew what was coming. As Jake rounded a bend near Avalanche Creek, that's when he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of frozen trees. It was crying. High-pitched, desperate crying that sounded almost human. But Jake knew better. In his years as a ranger, he'd learned to identify every sound the wilderness could make. This was a bear cub. Jake's heart sank. A bear cub crying in March meant only one thing. It was alone. Mother bears don't abandon their cubs unless something terrible has happened. And with the worst storm in decades about to hit, this little one didn't stand a chance. Following the sound, Jake pushed through a cluster of snow-laden pine trees. That's when he saw something that would haunt him forever. There in a small clearing was the tiniest grizzly bear cub he'd ever seen. It couldn't have been more than 4 months old, probably weighing no more than 20 pounds. Its golden brown fur was matted with ice crystals, and it was shivering so violently that Jake could see it from 30 feet away. But what broke Jake's heart wasn't just seeing the cub. It was what the little bear was doing. The cub was sitting next to what was clearly its mother, a massive female grizzly who lay motionless in the snow. Jake didn't need to get closer to know she was gone. The way she lay, the way the snow had already begun to cover her, told him everything he needed to know. The cub looked up at Jake with the most human-like expression of grief and desperation he'd ever seen on an animal. Those dark brown eyes seemed to be pleading, asking questions that Jake wished he could answer. Where did Mama go? Why won't she wake up? Can you help me? Jake's training kicked in. Protocol was clear. Don't interfere with wildlife. Let nature take its course. But as he looked at this tiny, helpless creature, every rule he'd ever learned seemed meaningless. The wind was getting stronger, and the temperature was dropping fast. In less than an hour, this area would be hit with hurricane-force winds and temperatures well below zero. Nothing could survive out here, especially not a baby bear who should still be in a den with its mother. Jake took a step closer, and something incredible happened. Instead of running away like any wild animal should, the cub stood up on its hind legs and took a wobbly step toward him. It made a sound that Jake had never heard before. Not quite a bark, not quite a whine, but something that sounded remarkably like, "Help me." "Hey there, little guy," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing wind. "I see you there." "I see you." The cub tilted its head as if it understood. Then it did something that made Jake's decision for him. The little bear walked over to its mother, gently nudged her with its tiny paw, then looked back at Jake and made that same pleading sound. It was as if the cub was saying, "Please, can you wake her up? Can you fix this?" Jake knew he had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. He could follow protocol, leave the cub and head back to safety. The cub would likely not survive the night, but that was nature's way. Or he could risk everything, his job, his safety, possibly his life, to try to save this little creature who had already lost everything. As if sensing Jake's internal struggle, the storm chose that moment to unleash its fury. The wind suddenly howled to life, bending trees and sending a wall of snow across the clearing. Jake could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He had minutes, maybe less, before visibility would drop to zero. The cub cried out again, this time more desperately. It had moved closer to Jake, now only about 15 feet away. In the growing chaos of the storm, Jake could see the little bear was trying to make a decision too. It kept looking back at its mother, then at Jake, as if torn between staying with the only family it had ever known and following this strange human who represented its only hope of survival. Jake made his choice. "Okay, buddy," he called out over the wind. "I don't know if this is right, but I can't leave you here. If you want to come with me, you need to follow me right now. We've got to move." Jake turned and started walking back toward the trail. He didn't look back, but he listened. Over the roar of the wind, he heard something that gave him hope. The soft padding of tiny paws in the snow behind him. The cub was following. What happened next would become the most extraordinary journey that Jake Morrison had ever been part of. As he began the long trek back to the ranger station, Jake quickly realized that saving this cub was going to be far more challenging than he had imagined. The storm was intensifying with every passing minute, and the little bear, despite its brave decision to follow, was struggling terribly. The first mile was heartbreaking to watch. The cub, who Jake had started calling Bear in his mind, could barely keep up. Its little legs were so short that it had to bound through the snow like a rabbit, expending enormous amounts of energy just to move forward. Every few hundred yards, the exhausted cub would stop, sit down in the snow and look back in the direction they had come from. "I know, buddy," Jake would say, stopping and waiting. "I know you want to go back to Mama, but she can't help you now. I'm all you've got." Each time, after a moment of what looked like deep consideration, the cub would struggle back to its feet and continue following. Jake was amazed by the little bear's determination, but he was also growing increasingly worried. At this pace, in these conditions, they would never make it back before the worst of the storm hit. By the second mile, Jake made a decision that probably saved both their lives. He started breaking trail for the cub, using his snowshoes to create a packed path that the little bear could follow more easily. It meant Jake had to work twice as hard, breaking through the deep snow ahead of them. But it allowed the cub to conserve energy and move faster. The wind was now howling at over 40 miles per hour, and the snow was falling so heavily that Jake could barely see his own feet. He had to rely on his GPS device and his knowledge of the trail to navigate. Several times he nearly walked off the path entirely, only realizing his mistake when he felt the ground drop away beneath his feet. But the most incredible thing was happening behind him. Every time Jake looked back to check on the cub, there it was, a tiny brown and gold figure determinedly pushing through the snow, following the path Jake had created. The little bear never gave up, never turned back, even when Jake was sure it must be at the absolute limit of its endurance. During the third mile, something changed in their relationship. The cub started staying closer to Jake, sometimes walking just a few feet behind him, instead of the 30 or 40 feet it had maintained before. When Jake stopped to rest and check his GPS, the cub would sit down right next to him, close enough that Jake could feel the warmth of its small body. "You're a tough little guy, aren't you?" Jake said during one of these rest stops, looking down at the cub who was panting heavily, its tiny pink tongue hanging out. "Tougher than most humans I know." The cub looked up at him with those expressive brown eyes, and Jake could swear he saw understanding there. It was as if the little bear knew that Jake was risking everything to save it, and it was determined not to let him down. The fourth mile nearly broke them both. The storm had reached its full fury, with winds gusting up to 60 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to nearly 20 below zero. Jake's exposed skin was going numb despite his winter gear, and he was starting to worry about frostbite. But his biggest concern was the cub. The little bear was moving slower now, and Jake could see it was struggling to maintain its body temperature. Its fur was completely covered in ice crystals, and it was shivering constantly. Worst of all, it had started making soft whimpering sounds with each step, as if its paws were hurting from the cold and rough terrain. Jake knew they were in serious trouble. At this rate, even if they didn't get lost in the whiteout conditions, the cub might not survive the remaining 4 miles. He had to make another difficult decision. Stopping in the shelter of a large pine tree, Jake knelt down in the snow. The cub immediately came over to him, pressing its small body against his leg. Jake could feel how cold the little bear was, even through his thick pants. "Listen, buddy," Jake said, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "I know this is scary, but I need you to trust me completely now. We're not going to make it if we keep going like this. Jake unzipped his heavy winter coat and looked down at the cub. I need you to let me carry you for a while. I know you're wild, and I know this goes against every instinct you have, but it's our only chance. What happened next still gives Jake chills when he thinks about it. The cub looked up at him for a long moment, as if considering the proposal. Then, to Jake's amazement, the little bear stood up on its hind legs and placed its front paws on Jake's knee, as if asking to be picked up. Jake carefully scooped up the cub and held it against his chest inside his coat. The little bear was so cold that Jake could feel it shivering against his body, but it didn't struggle or try to escape. Instead, it seemed to understand that this was survival, and it curled up against Jake's warm chest like a domestic pet might. With the cub safely tucked inside his coat, Jake was able to move much faster. The extra weight was challenging, but knowing that the little bear was warm and safe gave him strength he didn't know he had. Mile 5 passed more quickly, then mile 6, but it was during mile 7 that the most incredible thing happened, something that still moves Jake to tears when he tells this story. As they were pushing through a particularly difficult section of trail, Jake suddenly realized he was in trouble. The combination of exhaustion, cold, and the extra weight of carrying the cub had pushed him to his limit. His legs were shaking, his vision was blurring, and he was starting to stumble. He was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia, and he knew it. Jake stopped and leaned against a tree, breathing heavily. He was scared, not just for himself now, but for the little creature depending on him. If he collapsed out here, they would both die. That's when he felt something that shocked him completely. The cub had poked its head out of his coat and was looking up at him with what Jake could only describe as concern. Then the little bear did something extraordinary. It started making soft, encouraging sounds, almost like it was trying to comfort Jake and urge him to keep going. "You're trying to help me now, aren't you?" Jake whispered, looking down at those intelligent brown eyes. "After everything you've been through, you're trying to take care of me." The cub made that soft sound again and gently pawed at Jake's chest, as if saying, "Well, come on, we can do this together." Jake found strength he didn't know he still had. With the cub encouraging him from inside his coat, he pushed off from the tree and started walking again. One step at a time, one breath at a time, with a tiny grizzly bear as his motivation and his companion. By the time they reached mile 8, Jake could see the lights of the ranger station through the snow. But he was at the absolute end of his endurance. His legs were barely functioning, and he was stumbling more than walking. The cub seemed to sense they were close to safety and had poked its head out again. Looking ahead toward the lights, as they approached the station, Jake could see his colleague Sarah rushing out to meet them. She had been watching for him on the radio and had grown worried when he hadn't checked in. "Jake, thank God," she called out as she reached them. "I was about to send out a search team. What happened out there?" Jake was too exhausted to speak coherently, but he carefully opened his coat to reveal his small passenger. Sarah's eyes went wide as she saw the tiny grizzly cub looking back at her with bright, alert eyes. "Oh my God, Jake," she whispered. "What have you done?" What Jake had done by bringing the cub to safety was just the beginning of an even bigger battle. As Sarah helped them inside the warm ranger station, the reality of the situation began to hit both of them. Jake had just violated every wildlife protection protocol in the book, and the consequences could be severe. But looking at the tiny, shivering cub in his arms, Jake knew he would make the same choice 1,000 times over. "Jake, you need to get out of those wet clothes immediately," Sarah said, her training as an emergency medical technician kicking in. "You're showing signs of mild hypothermia. And that cub, we need to figure out what to do with it fast." Jake carefully placed the cub on a thick blanket near the wood stove. The little bear immediately curled up into a tight ball, still shivering but clearly relieved to be somewhere warm and safe. For the first time since Jake had found it, the cub wasn't crying. It just lay there, occasionally lifting its head to look around the room as if trying to understand where it was. "Sarah, I know what you're thinking," Jake said as he changed into dry clothes. "I know I broke protocol. I know I could lose my job over this. But I couldn't leave that cub out there to die. Its mother was already gone and the storm would have killed it within hours." Sarah looked at the cub, then back at Jake. She had worked with Jake for 6 years, and she knew he wasn't the type to make reckless decisions. If he had brought this cub back, there had to be a good reason. Tell me exactly what happened out there, she said, pouring Jake a cup of hot coffee. As Jake recounted the story of finding the cub and their 8-mile journey through the blizzard, Sarah's expression changed from concern to amazement. She kept looking over at the little bear, who seemed to be listening to Jake's voice with what looked like recognition and comfort. "Jake, do you realize what you're describing?" Sarah said when he finished. "Wild bear cubs don't follow humans. They don't let humans pick them up and carry them. They especially don't try to comfort and encourage humans when they're struggling." "What you're describing sounds more like what?" Jake asked. "Like the cub chose you. Like it somehow understood that you were its only chance for survival, and it made a conscious decision to trust you completely." Before Jake could respond, they both heard a sound that made their hearts skip. It was the rumble of a truck engine outside, fighting through the storm. Jake looked out the window and felt his stomach drop. "It's Chief Ranger Martinez," he said. "Someone must have reported that I was overdue." Chief Martinez was a good man, but he was also a strict follower of regulations. If he found out what Jake had done, there would be serious consequences. Jake looked at the cub, who had raised its head at the sound of the approaching vehicle. "Sarah, I need you to understand something," Jake said urgently. "I don't regret what I did. But if Martinez sees this cub, he'll have no choice but to report it. Fish and wildlife will take the cub, and honestly, at its age and without its mother, they'll probably euthanize it. That little guy didn't survive an 8-mile journey through a blizzard just to be put down because of bureaucracy." Sarah looked at Jake, then at the cub, then back at Jake. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to help me give this cub a real chance at life." The front door of the station burst open, and Chief Martinez stomped in, shaking snow off his heavy coat. He was a large man in his 50s, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the wilderness. "Morrison, thank God you made it back," he said, genuine relief in his voice. "When you didn't check in, I thought we might have to mount a rescue operation in this weather. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Chief," Jake said, positioning himself between Martinez and the area where the cub was lying. "Just took longer than expected to complete the patrol. The storm hit earlier than forecasted." Martinez nodded, looking around the station. His eyes stopped on the wet winter gear hanging by the stove, then moved to the extra blankets on the floor. His expression became more alert. "Morrison, is there something you need to tell me?" Martinez asked, his tone becoming more official. Jake felt his heart pounding. This was the moment of truth. He could lie. Hope Martinez didn't discover the cub and figure out what to do later, or he could trust his chief and hope for understanding. Before Jake could answer, the decision was made for him. The cub, apparently hearing the stress in Jake's voice, poked its head up from the blanket and made a soft sound. Martinez's eyes went wide as he saw the tiny Grizzly looking back at him. "Morrison," Martinez said slowly, "please tell me you have a very good explanation for why there is a grizzly bear cub in my ranger station." Jake took a deep breath. "Chief, I found that cub next to its dead mother about 8 miles out on the Avalanche Creek Trail. The storm was getting worse and the cub would have died if I left it there. I know I broke protocol, but I couldn't let it die." Martinez stared at the cub, then at Jake. The room was silent except for the sound of wind howling outside and the crackling of the fire. The cub, sensing the tension, made a small whimpering sound and looked toward Jake as if seeking reassurance. "Morrison, do you have any idea what you've done?" Martinez asked. "Do you understand the legal implications? The safety concerns? The complete violation of wildlife management protocols?" Jake felt his career crashing down around him, but he stood his ground. "Yes, sir. I understand all of that, but I also understand that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules." Martinez walked closer to the cub, who watched him warily, but didn't try to run. The chief knelt down and observed the little bear for a long moment. The cub tilted its head and made a soft sound, almost as if it were trying to communicate. "Tell me about the journey back," Martinez said quietly. Jake described the 8-mile trek, the cub's determination to follow, how it had let Jake carry it and how it had seemed to encourage Jake when he was struggling. As he spoke, Martinez's expression gradually changed. "The cub let you pick it up and carry it?" Martinez asked. "Yes, sir. It even seemed to understand that it was necessary for survival." Martinez stood up and looked at both Jake and Sarah. "In 30 years of wildlife management, I've never heard of behavior like that from a wild grizzly cub. What you're describing suggests a level of intelligence and trust that's almost unheard of. Jake felt a spark of hope. Chief, I know I broke the rules, but Martinez held up his hand. Morrison, what you did was reckless, dangerous, and completely against protocol. Jake's heart sank. But then Martinez continued. It was also one of the most compassionate and brave things I've ever heard of a ranger doing. Jake looked up in surprise. Martinez was looking at the cub with something that looked like wonder. However, Martinez continued, we now have a serious problem. By law, I have to report this to Fish and Wildlife. And you know what they'll say. They'll want to euthanize it, Sarah said quietly. Probably, Martinez admitted. A 4-month-old cub without its mother, showing unusual behavior toward humans. They'll consider it a safety risk and recommend euthanization. Jake felt anger rising in his chest. Chief, that cub isn't a safety risk. It's a survivor. It made a choice to trust me, and that choice saved its life. We can't let bureaucrats destroy what we saved. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, watching the cub. The little bear had curled up again but was still watching the humans, as if it understood that its fate was being decided. There might be another option, Martinez said slowly. But it would require all of us to be very careful about how we handle this. What kind of option? Jake asked. There's a wildlife rehabilitation center about 2 hours south of here. It's run by a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez. She specializes in orphaned bear cubs, and she has a reputation for working outside the system when necessary to save animals. Sarah leaned forward. You mean we don't report this officially? I mean we report finding a dead mother bear, which is true. And we report that no cub was found, which will become true if we can get this little guy to Dr. Vasquez safely. Jake felt hope flooding through him. You'd do that? You'd risk your career to save this cub? Martinez looked at Jake, then at the cub. Morrison, in all my years as a ranger, I've never seen an animal choose a human the way this cub chose you. That tells me something special is happening here. And sometimes the rules don't account for special circumstances. What Chief Martinez was proposing was risky for all of them, but as they sat in the warm ranger station watching the tiny cub sleep peacefully by the fire, they all knew it was the right thing to do. The storm outside was still raging, making travel impossible for at least another 12 hours. That gave them time to plan, but it also meant they would have to care for the cub overnight, something none of them had ever done before. First things first, Sarah said, always practical. This little guy needs food and water. What do 4-month-old grizzly cubs eat? Jake realized they were facing a challenge he hadn't even considered during their desperate journey back to the station. In the wild, the cub would still be nursing from its mother, supplemented with whatever solid food she provided. They had nothing appropriate for feeding a baby bear. Dr. Vasquez will know what to do long-term, Martinez said, but we need to keep this cub alive and healthy until we can get it to her. Sarah, do we have any condensed milk or formula in our emergency supplies? Sarah checked their medical and emergency kits, while Jake continued to watch the cub. The little bear had been sleeping for about an hour, but now it was stirring, making soft sounds that Jake was beginning to recognize as hunger cries. I found some powdered milk and some protein bars, Sarah called from the supply room. It's not ideal, but it might work temporarily. As Sarah began mixing the powdered milk with warm water, the cub fully awakened and sat up. It looked around the room, and Jake could see confusion in its eyes. The little bear was probably wondering where its mother was, why it was in this strange place, and what was happening to it. Hey there, buddy, Jake said softly, kneeling down near the cub. I know this is all very strange and scary, but you're safe now. We're going to take care of you. What happened next amazed all 3 humans in the room. The cub looked directly at Jake and made a sound that was unmistakably a response to his voice. Then it stood up and walked over to Jake, sitting down right next to him and leaning against his leg. Unbelievable, Martinez whispered. Feels like it actually understands you. Sarah approached with a shallow bowl of the milk mixture. Let's see if we can get some food into this little guy. Jake placed the bowl on the floor near the cub. The little bear sniffed at it cautiously, then looked up at Jake as if asking for permission or guidance. Jake gently touched the surface of the milk with his finger, then brought it close to the cub's nose. It's okay, he said. It's food. You need to eat to stay strong. The cub sniffed Jake's finger, then cautiously approached the bowl. After a moment of hesitation, it began to lap at the milk. Within minutes, the bowl was empty, and the cub was looking around hopefully for more. "Well, that's a good sign," Sarah said, refilling the bowl. "A hungry cub is usually a healthy cub." As they fed the cub and watched it explore the station, Jake found himself thinking about what Dr. Vasquez would be like. Martinez had described her as someone who worked outside the system, but what did that really mean? Would she be willing to take in a cub under these circumstances? And if she did, what would happen to the little bear then? "Chief," Jake said as the cub settled down for another nap, "tell me more about Dr. Vasquez. What makes you think she'll help us?" Martinez sat down in his chair by the radio, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb the sleeping cub. Elena Vasquez used to work for Fish and Wildlife, actually. She was one of their top bear specialists. But she left about 5 years ago to start her own rehabilitation center. Why did she leave? Sarah asked. Because she got tired of watching healthy, savable animals get euthanized due to bureaucratic policies. The last straw was when Fish and Wildlife ordered her to put down a family of bear cubs whose mother had been killed by poachers. The cubs were healthy and could have been rehabilitated, but policy said they were too young and too habituated to humans. Jake felt his stomach tighten. What did she do? She quit her job and started her own center. Officially, she follows all the proper procedures and works within the system. Unofficially, she has a reputation for taking in animals that other facilities won't touch. Animals that would otherwise be euthanized. And you trust her? Jake asked. Martinez nodded. She saved my nephew's dog once. Long story, but the point is, she's someone who puts animal welfare above bureaucracy. If anyone can help this cub, it's her. They spent the rest of the night taking turns watching the cub and monitoring the storm. By morning, the winds had died down enough to make travel possible, though still dangerous. Martinez had already called Dr. Vasquez, using a coded conversation that made their situation clear without stating anything directly over the radio. "She's expecting us," Martinez told Jake as they prepared to leave. "She said to bring the package as soon as travel conditions permit." Jake carefully placed the cub inside his coat again. The little bear seemed to remember this arrangement and settled against Jake's chest without resistance. If anything, it seemed comforted by the familiar warmth and the sound of Jake's heartbeat. The drive to Dr. Vasquez's facility was tense and challenging. The roads were barely passable, covered with snow and ice from the storm. Martinez drove slowly and carefully, while Jake kept the cub calm and Sarah navigated using GPS and radio updates about road conditions. During the 2-hour journey, Jake found himself growing more attached to the little bear. The cub had been through so much trauma, losing its mother, nearly freezing to death, being handled by humans, yet it seemed to trust Jake completely. Gad slept peacefully against his chest, occasionally stirring to look up at him with those expressive brown eyes before settling back down. "You know," Sarah said quietly as they drove, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the cub choosing you. I think there might be more to that than we realized." "What do you mean?" Jake asked. "I mean, maybe the cub didn't just choose you as a rescuer. Maybe it chose you as something more, like a surrogate parent figure." Jake felt a pang in his chest at the thought. He had never had children of his own, and the idea that this little creature might see him as a parent figure was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Heartwarming because of the trust it represented, and heartbreaking because he knew their time together was limited. Dr. Vasquez's rehabilitation center was located on a large property surrounded by forest. As they pulled up to the main building, Jake could see several large enclosures in the distance, some containing what looked like adult bears. The facility was clearly well established and professional. Dr. Vasquez met them at the door. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind but sharp eyes and the confident manner of someone who had spent years working with dangerous animals. She looked at Jake holding the cub and immediately understood the situation. "So this is our little survivor," she said softly, approaching slowly so as not to frighten the cub. "May I see him?" Jake carefully opened his coat to reveal the cub, who blinked up at Dr. Vasquez with curiosity, but no fear. The doctor extended her hand slowly, allowing the cub to sniff her before gently touching its head. "He's beautiful," she said, "and he looks healthy considering what he's been through. You did good work getting him here safely." "Dr. Vasquez," Jake said, "I need you to know that this cub is special, The bond we formed during our journey, it's unlike anything I've experienced with a wild animal. Dr. Vasquez studied Jake's face, then looked back at the cub. I can see that. And I can also see that this separation is going to be hard on both of you. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The moment he had been dreading was here. He had to say goodbye to the little creature who had trusted him with its life. What will happen to him now? Jake managed to ask. Dr. Vasquez smiled gently. Now we give him the best possible chance at a real life. But Jake, I want you to understand something. What you and this cub have been through together has created a bond that doesn't just disappear. If you're willing, I'd like you to be part of his rehabilitation process. Jake looked up in surprise. What do you mean? I mean, this cub trusts you in a way that could actually help his recovery and his chances of successful release back to the wild. Would you be willing to visit regularly to help with his care and training? Jake felt hope flooding through him. He wouldn't have to say goodbye forever. He could still be part of the cub's life, help ensure its successful return to the wilderness where it belonged. Yes, Jake said without hesitation. Absolutely yes. As they prepared to transfer the cub to Dr. Vasquez's care, Jake took one more moment to look into those intelligent brown eyes. You're going to be okay, buddy, he whispered. This is where you learn to be a real bear again. But I'll be back to check on you, I promise. The cub made that soft sound Jake had come to recognize, as if it understood and approved of the plan. And as Jake gently placed the little bear in Dr. Vasquez's experienced hands, he knew that this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something even more extraordinary. 3 weeks had passed since Jake first brought the cub to Dr. Vasquez's rehabilitation center, and the transformation he witnessed during his visits was nothing short of miraculous. The tiny, frightened creature that had followed him through the blizzard was growing stronger, braver and more bear-like every day. But the bond between Jake and the cub, whom Dr. Vasquez had officially named Storm in honor of how they met, remained as strong as ever. Jake made the 2-hour drive to the center every weekend, and each visit revealed new developments in Storm's rehabilitation. Dr. Vasquez had designed a careful program that would gradually prepare Storm for eventual release back into the wild. But she had also incorporated Jake's unique relationship with the cub into the training process in ways that surprised everyone involved. Jake, what you and Storm have is actually helping his rehabilitation in ways I never expected, Dr. Vasquez explained during one of Jake's visits. Normally, we try to minimize human contact with cubs to prevent habituation. But Storm's trust in you is actually building his confidence to explore and learn new behaviors. Jake watched through the observation window as Storm played in his enclosure. The cub had grown significantly. He now weighed almost 40 pounds and was becoming more coordinated and playful. But what amazed Jake most was watching Storm interact with the other rehabilitation animals. Dr. Vasquez had introduced Storm to 2 other orphaned cubs who had arrived at the center around the same time. At first, Storm had been hesitant and preferred to stay close to the areas where he had spent time with Jake. But gradually, his natural bear instincts began to emerge, and he started playing, wrestling, and exploring with his new companions. Watch this, Dr. Vasquez said, opening the door to the enclosure. Storm immediately looked up and made the soft sound that Jake had come to recognize as his greeting call. But instead of running directly to Jake as he had done in earlier visits, Storm first looked back at his playmates, as if checking on them, before approaching. He's learning to balance his attachment to you with his natural bear behaviors, Dr. Vasquez explained. That's exactly what we want to see. Jake knelt down as Storm approached, and the young bear immediately pressed against him in their familiar greeting. But Jake noticed something different. Storm was bigger now, stronger and more confident. The frightened, desperate cub from the blizzard was transforming into a healthy young grizzly. How's his hunting and foraging training going? Jake asked as Storm settled down beside him. Better than expected, Dr. Vasquez said with pride. We've been hiding food around the enclosure to encourage natural foraging behaviors, and Storm has shown excellent instincts. He's also started to show interest in fishing, which is crucial for a grizzly's survival. As if to demonstrate, Dr. Vasquez led them to a small stream that ran through the enclosure. She had placed several fish in the shallow water, and Jake watched in amazement as Storm waded in and, after several attempts, successfully caught one. 3 weeks ago, He wouldn't even go near the water, Dr. Vasquez said. Now look at him. But the most remarkable moment of that visit came when it was time for Jake to leave. In previous visits, Storm had become distressed when Jake prepared to go, whimpering and trying to follow him to the gate. This time, Storm walked with Jake to the enclosure exit. But when Jake said goodbye, the young bear simply sat down and watched him leave without distress. He's learning that you'll come back, Dr. Vasquez observed. That's a sign of healthy emotional development. He's maintaining his bond with you while also learning independence. During the drive home, Jake felt a mixture of pride and melancholy. He was thrilled to see Storm developing into a healthy, capable bear, but he also knew that each successful step in the cubs' rehabilitation brought them closer to the day when Storm would be released back into the wild, and their unique relationship would come to an end. The following week brought unexpected developments. Dr. Vasquez called Jake on Tuesday evening with news that made his heart race. "Jake, we have a situation with Storm that I think you need to know about," she said, her voice containing a mixture of concern and fascination. "What kind of situation?" Jake asked, immediately worried. Storm has been displaying some unusual behaviors over the past few days. He's been spending a lot of time at the far end of his enclosure, the part that faces north toward Glacier National Park. He sits there for hours, just looking in that direction, and he's been making vocalizations we haven't heard before. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of vocalizations? Long, low calls, almost like he's trying to communicate with something far away. "Jake, I think Storm might be trying to call to other bears in his original territory. Is that normal for a cub his age?" "That's just it. It's not normal at all. Cubs don't typically show territorial awareness until they're much older. But Storm seems to have developed an unusual sense of place and belonging. I think your journey together through his original habitat may have imprinted those locations in his memory more strongly than we realized." Dr. Vasquez paused, then continued. "Jake, there's something else. Yesterday, Storm led the other cubs to the north-facing area of the enclosure and seemed to be teaching them his calling behavior. It's like he's trying to share his knowledge of the territory with them." Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. What does this mean for his rehabilitation? It means Storm is developing exactly the kind of territorial and social awareness that will help him survive in the wild. But it also means he's ready for the next phase of his training much earlier than we expected. What's the next phase? Pre-release conditioning in a larger, more natural environment. "Jake, I think it's time to consider moving Storm to our satellite facility up in the mountains. It's a 200-acre semi-wild area where cubs learn final survival skills before release." Jake's heart sank. The satellite facility was 4 hours away, much too far for regular visits. Moving Storm there would mean the beginning of the end of their relationship. How long would he be there? Jake asked. "Typically 6 to 8 months. And Jake, during that time, human contact is minimal. We need Storm to fully embrace his wild nature before release." That weekend, Jake made what he knew might be his last regular visit to Storm. As he watched the young bear playing with his companions, Jake was struck by how much Storm had changed. The cub was now clearly the leader of his small group, and he moved with the confidence and grace of a natural predator. When Storm came over to greet Jake, the interaction felt different. The young bear was affectionate, but also somewhat distracted, as if his attention was increasingly focused on things beyond their relationship. "He's ready, isn't he?" Jake asked Dr. Vasquez as they watched Storm demonstrate fishing techniques to the other cubs. "Yes, he is. Jake, what you gave Storm wasn't just rescue. You gave him the confidence and trust he needed to embrace his wild nature. That's the greatest gift you could have given him." As the visit drew to a close, Jake knelt down for what he suspected might be his final close interaction with Storm. The young bear approached and, in their familiar ritual, pressed against Jake's side. But this time, Storm also did something new. He gently placed a paw on Jake's arm and looked directly into his eyes for a long moment. "He's saying thank you," Dr. Vasquez said softly, "and goodbye." Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes as he realized she was right. Storm seemed to understand that their relationship was changing, and in his own way, he was acknowledging everything they had been through together. "Thank you too, buddy," Jake whispered, "for trusting me, for teaching me what courage really looks like. for showing me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone else find their way home. Storm made that soft sound one last time, then turned and walked back to his companions. As Jake watched the young bear rejoin his group, he knew that while their daily relationship was ending, the bond they had forged during that desperate journey through the blizzard would last forever. The next week, Storm was transferred to the mountain facility to begin his final preparation for release into the wild. 6 months had passed since Storm's transfer to the mountain facility, and Jake had thrown himself into his work to cope with missing the young bear he had rescued. Dr. Vasquez sent periodic updates. Storm was thriving in the semi-wild environment, had grown to over 150 pounds, and was displaying all the behaviors of a healthy wild grizzly bear. But as autumn approached, Jake received a phone call that would change everything. "Jake, it's Eleanor," Dr. Vasquez's voice came through the phone, filled with an excitement Jake hadn't heard before. "I need you to come up to the mountain facility. There's something happening with Storm that I think you need to see for yourself." "Is everything okay?" Jake asked, immediately concerned. "Is Storm hurt?" "Storm is fine, more than fine actually. But Jake, he's doing something that's unprecedented in all my years of bear rehabilitation. Can you get here this weekend?" The drive to the mountain facility took Jake through some of the most beautiful wilderness in Montana. As he climbed higher into the mountains, he found himself thinking about that night 8 months ago, when he had first found Storm in the blizzard. The tiny, frightened cub who had followed him 8 miles through the storm was now a nearly adult bear, preparing to return to the wild where he belonged. Dr. Vasquez met Jake at the facility's main building, and he could immediately see the excitement in her eyes. "Jake, before I show you what's happening, I need you to understand that what Storm is doing is extremely rare. In fact, I've never heard of it happening before." "What is he doing?" Jake asked. "He's teaching. Storm has become a mentor to the other bears here, teaching them survival skills and behaviors that he shouldn't even know yet. But more than that, he's been calling. Calling? Come with me," Dr. Vasquez said, leading Jake to an observation point that overlooked the 200-acre facility. "Storm has been making long-distance vocalizations every morning and evening. At first, we thought it was just normal bear communication. But then we realized something incredible. He's been getting responses." Jake looked out over the facility and immediately spotted Storm. The young bear had grown magnificent. His golden brown coat was thick and glossy. His build was powerful and muscular, and he moved with the confident grace of a wild predator. But what struck Jake most was Storm's posture as he stood on a rocky outcropping, his head raised toward the distant mountains. "He's calling to bears in Glacier National Park," Dr. Vasquez explained. "His birth territory. And Jake, they're calling back. We've documented at least 3 different adult bears responding to his vocalizations over the past month." As if summoned by their conversation, Storm suddenly raised his head and let out a long, deep call that echoed across the mountains. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, filled with longing and intelligence. Within minutes, a distant response came from the direction of Glacier National Park. "How is that possible?" Jake asked in amazement. "The park is over 30 miles away. Bear vocalizations can travel incredible distances in mountain terrain," Dr. Vasquez explained. "But what's remarkable isn't just that Storm is communicating over that distance. It's that he seems to remember his birth territory and is actively trying to re-establish connections there." As they watched, Storm climbed down from the rocky outcropping and approached a group of younger bears. Jake watched in fascination as Storm seemed to demonstrate various behaviors. How to identify edible plants, how to mark territory, how to read wind patterns for scents. "He's preparing them," Dr. Vasquez said softly. "Storm knows that several of these bears will be released into the same general area where he'll be released. He's teaching them what he somehow remembers about that territory." "But how can he remember?" Jake asked. "He was just a 4-month-old cub when I found him. That's what makes this so extraordinary. Young bears learn their territory by following their mothers for their first year or 2. Storm only had a few months with his mother, but somehow the trauma and intensity of losing her, combined with your journey through that territory, created an indelible memory map." Jake felt a chill as he realized the implications. "You're saying that our walk through the blizzard, when he was following me, he was actually learning and remembering the route?" "I think he was doing more than that. I think Storm was imprinting every detail of that journey. The smells, the landmarks, the feel of his home territory. And now he's using that knowledge to prepare other bears for release into the same area. Over the next several hours, Jake observed behaviors in Storm that seemed almost supernatural in their intelligence and awareness. The young bear had clearly become the leader of the facility's bear population, and his influence on the other animals was remarkable. But the most incredible moment came that evening. As Jake was preparing to leave, Storm suddenly appeared at the fence line closest to where Jake was standing. For 8 months, Storm had been living with minimal human contact as part of his rehabilitation. Jake had been told that Storm might not even recognize him anymore. Instead, Storm approached the fence and made the soft sound that Jake remembered from their first meeting. The young bear looked directly at Jake with those same intelligent brown eyes, now set in the face of a powerful adult grizzly. "He remembers you," Dr. Vasquez said in wonder. "After all this time, with all his wild conditioning, he still remembers you." Jake knelt down near the fence and Storm pressed close to the barrier between them. For a moment, it was as if they were back in the ranger station, a tiny cub seeking comfort from the human who had saved his life. "Hey there, buddy," Jake said softly. "Look at you. You've become everything I hoped you would become." Storm made that familiar sound again, then did something that brought tears to Jake's eyes. The young bear placed his large paw against the fence, directly across from where Jake's hand rested on the other side. "He's thanking you again," Dr. Vasquez said quietly. "And I think he's also saying goodbye." "Goodbye?" Jake asked. "Jake, Storm is ready for release. All his behaviors indicate that he's prepared to return to the wild. We're planning to release him next month, right back in Glacier National Park, not far from where you found him." Jake felt a mixture of joy and sadness. This was what they had all been working toward, returning Storm to his natural habitat, where he could live as a wild bear. But it also meant their remarkable relationship would truly come to an end. "Will I be able to be there?" Jake asked. "For the release?" Dr. Vasquez smiled. "Jake, I wouldn't dream of releasing Storm without you there. You're the reason he's alive, and you're part of his story. You should be there to see him go home." As Jake prepared to leave that evening, Storm remained at the fence watching him. As Jake reached his truck, he heard a sound that made him turn back. Storm was calling again. That long, deep vocalization that carried across the mountains. But this time, Jake could swear the call was directed at him. A farewell from a friend who would never forget the human who had given him a second chance at life. The release was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and Jake knew that when that day came, he would be witnessing not just the return of a bear to the wild, but the completion of one of the most extraordinary journeys of trust, survival, and love he had ever been part of. Storm was going home, and Jake had played a part in making that miracle possible. The morning of Storm's release arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that seemed almost too good to be true. The sky was crystal clear, the mountains were painted in brilliant shades of gold and red, and there wasn't a breath of wind. Jake stood at the release site in Glacier National Park, just 3 miles from where he had first found Storm as a terrified cub 10 months earlier, and he could barely contain the emotions swirling through him. Dr. Vasquez and her team had been preparing for this moment for weeks. The release location had been carefully chosen. It was in Storm's original territory, had abundant food sources, and was far enough from human activity to give Storm the best chance of thriving as a wild bear. But despite all the preparation, Jake couldn't shake his nervousness about what was about to happen. "Jake, I want you to know that this is one of the most successful rehabilitations I've ever been part of," Dr. Vasquez said as they made final preparations. "Storm has exceeded every benchmark we have for a successful release. He's healthy, he has excellent survival skills, and most importantly, he's maintained his wild instincts while still retaining the confidence and problem-solving abilities that his relationship with you helped develop." Jake nodded, watching the large transport crate that contained Storm. He could hear the young bear moving around inside, and occasionally Storm would make soft vocalizations that sounded almost like he was talking to himself. The bear, who had once been small enough to carry inside Jake's coat, was now nearly 200 pounds of pure wild power. "What are his chances?" Jake asked, voicing the question that had been haunting him for weeks. "Better than any bear I've ever released," Dr. Vasquez said confidently. Storm has something that most rehabilitated bears don't have. He has a memory of this territory from his time with his birth mother, enhanced by his journey with you. He knows this area in a way that will give him a huge advantage. The release team finished their setup, and Dr. Vasquez approached the transport crate. Jake, would you like to do the honors? I think Storm would want you to be the one to open the door to his new life. Jake felt his hands trembling as he approached the crate. Through the ventilation slots, he could see Storm's familiar brown eyes looking back at him. The young bear seemed calm, almost expectant, as if he understood that something important was about to happen. Hey there, buddy, Jake said softly, placing his hand on the crate. This is it. This is your moment to go home. Storm made that soft sound Jake remembered so well, and then something incredible happened. The bear pressed against the side of the crate, right where Jake's hand was resting, just as he had done as a cub. It was as if Storm was saying, I'm ready and I know you'll always be with me. Jake unlatched the crate door and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door slowly swung open, and Storm emerged into the wilderness of his birth. What happened next will stay with Jake for the rest of his life. Storm stepped out of the crate and immediately raised his head, breathing deeply and taking in the sense of his home territory. His entire body language changed. He seemed to grow larger, more confident, more wild with each passing second. This wasn't the frightened cub from the blizzard, or even the playful young bear from the rehabilitation center. This was a wild grizzly bear, powerful and magnificent, exactly as nature intended. But then Storm did something that made everyone watching hold their breath. He turned back toward Jake and the release team, and for one long moment he simply looked at them. His gaze settled on Jake, and in those intelligent brown eyes, Jake saw recognition, gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like affection. Storm took a few steps toward Jake, close enough that Jake could see every detail of his beautiful face. The bear made one final soft vocalization, their special sound, and then he did something extraordinary. Storm gently bowed his massive head toward Jake, holding the position for several seconds in what could only be described as a gesture of respect and farewell. Did you see that? Dr. Vasquez whispered in amazement. I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of bear releases. Jake felt tears streaming down his face as he whispered back, Thank you too, Storm. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like. Then Storm turned toward the wilderness and began walking away. His movements were confident and purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Jake watched until the magnificent bear disappeared into the forest, and even then, he could occasionally catch glimpses of golden brown fur moving through the trees. Where do you think he's going? Jake asked. Dr. Vasquez had been tracking Storm's movements with binoculars. If I had to guess, I'd say he's heading toward the area where you found him. Bears often return to familiar territory when they're released. Over the next several hours, the team monitored Storm using radio telemetry. The young bear moved steadily through the forest, stopping occasionally to investigate food sources or mark territory. His behavior was textbook perfect for a newly released bear, cautious but confident, wild but intelligent. But the most remarkable development came that evening. As the sun began to set, Storm climbed to a high ridge and began calling. Those same long, deep vocalizations he had been making at the mountain facility. Within minutes, responses came from multiple directions. Other bears in the area were answering Storm's calls. He's announcing his return, Dr. Vasquez explained. He's letting the other bears in the area know that he's back and establishing his place in the local hierarchy. Jake listened to Storm's calls echoing across the mountains and felt a profound sense of completion. The frightened, orphaned cub who had followed him through a blizzard had become a confident, capable bear who was claiming his rightful place in the wilderness. As they prepared to leave the area, Jake took one last look toward the ridge where Storm had made his calls. The bear was no longer visible, but Jake knew he was out there, beginning his new life as a wild grizzly. Jake, Dr. Vasquez said as they packed up their equipment, what you did for Storm went far beyond just saving his life. You gave him the confidence and trust he needed to fully embrace his wild nature. That's the greatest gift any human can give a wild animal. Jake nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. He was proud of what Storm had become, but he also knew that this was truly goodbye. From now on, Storm would live as a wild bear, and their paths would probably never cross again. But as they drove away from the release site, Jake carried with him the memory of Storm's final gesture, that respectful bow that seemed to acknowledge everything they had been through together. It was a moment of communication between species that transcended words, a final thank you from a wild creature to the human who had given him a second chance at the life he was meant to live. Storm was home, and Jake had been privileged to play a part in one of nature's most beautiful stories of survival, trust and love. 2 years had passed since Storm's release, and Jake Morrison's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The story of his rescue of the orphaned Grizzly cub had spread far beyond the boundaries of Glacier National Park, inspiring wildlife conservationists, animal lovers, and ordinary people around the world. But the most profound changes had happened in Jake himself, and in the ongoing mission that Storm's story had sparked. Dr. Vasquez had stayed in touch with Jake, providing regular updates on Storm's progress in the wild. The news was better than anyone had dared to hope. Storm had not only survived his return to the wilderness, he had thrived. Using GPS tracking and remote cameras, they had documented Storm establishing a large territory, successfully foraging and hunting, and even beginning to show interest in potential mates. "Jake, you need to see this," Dr. Vasquez said during one of their regular phone calls. "We got some incredible footage from our remote cameras last week." The video she sent Jake showed Storm in his full wild glory, a massive, powerful grizzly bear who moved through his territory with complete confidence. But what made Jake's heart race was what happened next in the footage. Storm approached the camera location, which was near the spot where Jake had originally found him as a cub, and he began making those familiar long-distance calls. Within minutes, another bear appeared in the frame, a female grizzly who responded to Storm's vocalizations. Jake watched in amazement as Storm and the female interacted, clearly comfortable with each other. "Jake, we think Storm may have found a mate," Dr. Vasquez explained. "If that's true, it means he's not just surviving in the wild. He's preparing to pass on his genes and continue his family line. That's the ultimate success story for any wildlife rehabilitation." But the impact of Storm's story extended far beyond just one bear's successful return to the wild. Jake had started giving presentations about his experience, speaking at schools, wildlife organizations, and conservation groups. Every time he told Storm's story, he saw the same reaction in his audiences, a renewed sense of hope and connection to the natural world. "What Storm taught me," Jake would tell his audiences, "is that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply show up when someone needs us. Storm didn't need me to solve all his problems or change his fundamental nature. He just needed someone to care enough to help him get back to where he belonged." The presentations had led to something even more significant. Jake had partnered with Dr. Vasquez to establish the Storm Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting wildlife rehabilitation efforts and educating people about coexistence with wild animals. The foundation had already helped fund the rehabilitation of dozens of orphaned and injured animals. But perhaps the most meaningful development had come just 6 months earlier. Jake received a call from Dr. Vasquez that left him speechless. "Jake, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Our remote cameras have captured something extraordinary. Storm has become a father." The photographs Dr. Vasquez sent showed Storm with a female grizzly and 2 tiny cubs. Jake stared at the images with tears in his eyes, seeing Storm's protective posture as he watched over his own babies, cubs who would never know the terror of being orphaned and alone because their father was there to teach them everything they needed to know about being wild bears. Those cubs represent Storm's ultimate gift to the wilderness, Dr. Vasquez explained. Not only did Storm survive and thrive, but he's now passing on all the knowledge and instincts that made his survival possible. In a very real sense, your decision to save Storm that night in the blizzard has now resulted in 3 bears living free in the wild. Jake had framed one of the photographs, Storm standing proudly with his small family, and it now held a place of honor in his home. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded that individual acts of compassion can have ripple effects that extend far beyond what we can imagine. The story had also changed Jake's career path. He was still a park ranger, but he now specialized in human-wildlife conflict resolution, helping people and communities learn to coexist peacefully with the wild animals that shared their environment. Storm's story had become a powerful tool for teaching people that wildlife conservation isn't just about protecting animals. It's about preserving the connections that make us all part of the same natural world. On the second anniversary of Storm's release, Jake returned to the site where he had let Storm go free. He didn't expect to see the bear. Storm's territory was vast, and sightings were rare. But Jake wanted to mark the occasion by visiting the place where their remarkable journey together had reached its conclusion. As Jake stood in the clearing where Storm had emerged from his transport crate 2 years earlier, he reflected on everything that had changed since that night in the blizzard when a tiny cub had made the desperate decision to follow Wads, a human stranger, 8 miles through a deadly storm. That's when he heard it, a sound that made his heart stop. Long, deep calls echoing across the mountains, bare vocalizations coming from the ridge above the clearing. Jake looked up and felt his breath catch in his throat. There, silhouetted against the sky on the rocky outcropping, stood a massive grizzly bear. Even at a distance, Jake recognized the golden-brown coloring and the confident posture. It was Storm. The bear seemed to be looking directly down at Jake, and for a long moment, neither moved. Then Storm raised his head and let out another call, not the territorial vocalizations Jake had heard before, but something softer, more personal. It sounded remarkably like the greeting call Storm had made as a cub. Jake raised his hand in a small wave, and incredibly, Storm seemed to acknowledge the gesture by tilting his massive head. Then, as silently as he had appeared, Storm turned and disappeared back into the wilderness. Jake stood in the clearing for a long time after Storm vanished, overwhelmed by the realization that the bear had somehow known he was there. After 2 years of living completely wild, Storm had recognized Jake and taken a moment to acknowledge their shared history. As Jake drove home that evening, he thought about the incredible journey that had brought them both to this point. A frightened park ranger and a desperate orphaned cub had found each other in the worst possible circumstances, and together they had created something beautiful, a story of trust, survival, and love that had touched thousands of lives and would continue inspiring people for generations to come. Storm was no longer the little cub who had followed Jake through the blizzard. He was a wild grizzly bear, a father, and a symbol of the amazing things that become possible when humans choose compassion over indifference, courage over fear, and love over abandonment. And Jake Morrison was no longer just a park ranger doing his job. He was living proof that sometimes the most important thing any of us can do is simply show up when someone needs us most. If this incredible story of Storm and Jake touched your heart, please like this video and share it with everyone you know. Stories like this remind us that individual acts of kindness can create ripple effects that change the world. Subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories of human-animal bonds that will restore your faith in the power of compassion. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest heartwarming content.